Hello. Hi, Fred.
Hi, Daniel.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming and having this interview with me for the Signpreneur community. So the Signpreneur, Fred, is a community that I've been building. It's an initiative as well to help scientists who want to start venture science-backed ventures, or sometimes they've already started companies and they need support of any kinds. We know that as entrepreneurs, you are an entrepreneur, I am an entrepreneur. We know that as entrepreneurs, having support is super important. So this is like the idea behind our community, the Sciencepreneur community. So thanks for being here, talking to us, and sharing your experience with us. It is
No,
very
it's my
nice.
pleasure. Hopefully, these experiences can help others following a very similar trajectory.
For sure, it will. Yeah, for sure we will. You. This is a very special interview because this is the first time I am interviewing an investor in life sciences and science in general. Um, the prior interviews were with entrepreneurs or people who provide support for entrepreneurs in many different ways. And this is the first time you are an entrepreneur right now, but you've been an investor. The and that this is the first time we're going to have like a conversation from an investor perspective, which I'm very excited about. So why don't we start? I want to explore your life and your experience both as an investor and as an entrepreneur. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to the point you became an investor, and then we can keep going from there to discuss what happened after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just starting from the beginning. So, like you, I was also born in Brazil, and then I came to the US for my, higher education. So, I did a biology degree at Duke. I went to medical school right after that at Yale. Then, when I was in medical school, this is the first time that I started to contemplate the possibility of actually working in a more business background. I felt that in medical school, it was a transformational experience in terms of the things that we were learning. But I felt that there was really exciting new technology that was being developed in the real world. And I felt that in medicine, it takes a really long time for these things to actually become available to physicians. That combined with the fact that there wasn't any one medical specialty that really captured my imagination. I found myself more excited about the opportunity to be working with new technology than to be practicing medicine. Now, I didn't really have any business training. I think the maximum that I did prior to medical school was take one accounting class and maybe a microeconomics class when I was in college, but it was literally two different classes. And so I try to figure out what is the best job, when you're in medical school that allows you to go in and learn how to do business since I didn't have a business background. And there were two opportunities that I started to pursue. One was management consulting, and the second was investment banking. Both of those are jobs where they do like hiring people with advanced degrees, and they recognize that you're coming in very green in terms of a business background, and they give you some on-the-job training. So I ended up joining Boston Consulting Group. I spent a couple of years there. Um, while I was at the Boston Consulting Group, I realized that I did enjoy the business side of healthcare. So I decided to stay in healthcare. I applied to business school because I wanted to round out my overall knowledge. I worked with a lot of people at BCG that had MBAs, and it just felt like they had a certain level of knowledge that I did not have that could really help me as I was thinking of pursuing a business deal. Because I was still waiting for my green card at the time, I decided to actually take another job for a couple of years before going to business school. So I worked at a biotech company called Curagen. Coming from a consulting background, I joined in a corporate development role which would allow me to do a lot of very similar activities that I did at the Boston Consulting Group, but now focused in a single company. This was a 500-person company. It was a genomics company developing therapies, in oncology and a few other areas. And I had the opportunity to do some corporate development, some business development. So that was good to actually learn what happens inside a company. Went to business school, went to Harvard Business School, and following Harvard Business School, I was very intrigued to actually join investing. I felt that, as a venture capitalist, you could actually have a pretty broad view of what is happening in the world and the different companies that are just in development and doing exciting things. So that was my goal going into business school, to actually launch a career in venture capital. And so I graduated around 2006. So that's 15, 16 years ago. And then I joined Venrock for several years.
Very nice, very interesting. So at the time, was it common for medical students to pursue alternative careers like that? What happened to your classmates from medical school? Did many of them also pursue that kind of career, or was it something that was very unique at the time?
Yeah, it was still an emerging area. When I joined BCG, one of the senior partners at BCG, he was also an MD, and he had left medicine, 20 years prior to me joining. And so things like that had been happening, but it wasn't very common. We had a class of 100 people in medical school, and there were only two of us that did not pursue a residency. And,
Only two. Yeah.
only two. And it wasn't at the time, I think things have changed. And I think educators recognize that a medical degree can be very valuable in non practice settings. But I think at the time, it wasn't quite viewed that way. I think at the time, it was viewed that I took up a slot in medical school that could have gone to somebody that would have gone out and practiced medicine. So I can't say that I had a lot of support to actually make this transition. I think nowadays there's a greater appreciation of the value that MDs can provide. But at the time, it was still a little atypical. Now that I've graduated, it's been almost, 20, 25 years. I would say probably around 10 people in my class of 100 no longer practice medicine, and they're somehow involved in industry in one way or another.
But it's still a small number, isn't it? I mean, it's not considering that we're supposed to become clinicians after medical school. But yeah, I think the way I see many doctors referring to their or talking about their professions is that what I see is more and more people looking for alternative careers that could make use of a medical background. So it is becoming more common, but I'm not sure. Do you think that educators are more conscious about that, the medical curriculum has evolved to accommodate those non-clinical careers? Do you think?
I have heard of more programs that try to integrate an MD with additional degrees. I've heard of a number of MD, MBA programs. So
Yeah,
I
there's
think that's one track that's available to people. I know that, in medical schools, there's more classes on entrepreneurship and what happens on the business side. So that makes people more aware. I don't know that a lot of the practitioners in medical school, the educators in medical school, are necessarily trying to intentionally, let's say, stimulate people to pursue a path like that. But I do think that there are more opportunities for medical students to actually explore that. I felt that at the time, it was not easy for me to figure out a way to explore something outside of medicine. I think nowadays it would be a lot easier to find other people that did it than before.
Yeah, but you're right. My when I was doing my MBA at Wharton, there were medical students also pursuing the MBA, and it was a dual degree, like a MBA, MD/MD. Okay, that's awesome, Fred. So then you were an investor, and then you were working with Venrock. So how did you go from being an investor, working for a venture capital firm, which is quite relevant in the life sciences space, to becoming like a life sciences entrepreneur yourself?
Yeah, I really enjoyed my time at Venrock. People ask me, if you knew you were going to become an entrepreneur eventually, what's the value of having been an investor before becoming an entrepreneur? And I think
Yes.
it's incredibly valuable. There's a lot of people that do investing and then they become entrepreneurs. And there's a lot of people who are entrepreneurs and then they become investors later in life. There's no doubt that there's a lot of synergy between these experiences. So as an investor, I was a junior member of the Venrock Life Sciences team. I had an opportunity to work with really amazing people, and we probably during my time there, I probably met with over 1,000 companies. When you think about the MBA, and you did an MBA, Danielle, and you know the value of case studies, right? Like many schools, like Harvard Business School, for example, the only thing you do there are cases, and you do around 500 cases. And these
Right.
cases are designed to prepare you because by learning about how different businesses conducted, different sets of challenges and how they navigated those, then you go into the business world yourself with a pretty good idea of at least having seen something similar to what you're experiencing. I think venture takes that to the next level because when you're in venture, you are meeting literally with 1,000 different companies who are trying to do different things using different strategies, and they all have their own specific challenges. The challenges can be scientific, they can be commercial, they can be regulatory, they can be IP related, they can be people related. And as you're
Or all
going
of the above.
all of the above, right? Which we all experience as entrepreneurs, but it is such a focused opportunity to learn in depth how different products can be developed across most of the indications that are out there and across the different products you could have from drugs to diagnostics to devices. So I feel that by the time I left venture, I was really well equipped in terms of knowing a wide variety of ways to try to be creative about finding the right way to develop a product and to get it financed and to make sure that you're on the right track. Because as an investor, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't appreciate this, when an investor meets with an entrepreneur, you are obviously listening to the story to understand what the opportunity is. But part of your role as an investor, it's to triage. People don't think of an investment role as a triage job, but it is a triage job because, if you are meeting with 5, 6 companies per day, you don't have time to actually do really deep due diligence
Right.
on all of these companies, right? I would tell you that from the time, on average, from the time you meet a company to the time that you decide to invest as a venture capital, you're probably spending 50 hours at least, doing work to actually find out whether it is an investment that the fund may be interested in. So what are you doing during that time? You're asking really detailed questions from the entrepreneurs. You're calling advisors from the company. You're calling third-party consultants. You're calling members from industry. Sometimes you're bringing in regulatory consultants and clinical consultants. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into making an investment. So when I am sitting down meeting a company for the first time, I am doing a little bit of a triage, which is, can I figure out in this hour if this is a company that I'm going to have an interest in spending another 5, 10 hours, or is this a company that will unlikely meet the criteria needed to go forward? So during that time, I appreciate the things that are positive, but I'm trying to wrap my arms around the risks. Are there things that I'm seeing in this meeting that feel like they're too big of unknowns? And that poses a risk that will be very hard for me and the rest of the team to get through. And so if you end that hour and in your mind, you've sort of realized that you're not going to take the next step with the company, you've done your job. At the same time, if you spend that hour and you realize, wow, there's something really interesting here, I'd like to spend more time, that's also really exciting, right? And so that in a way is something that has helped me after I left investment, because now when I meet with investors, I realize that they're doing the same thing, right? They're meeting with me and they're trying to figure out if they can get excited about the things that I'm excited about, and if they can wrap their arms around the things that make them a little skeptical about all the risks that we're facing.
And if you were like a, for thinking of the entrepreneurs there might be watching this, and they're going to pitch their companies to investors, and the companies, this, I mean, there's only so much you can do. Like there is a company is already a reality, and it's an ongoing business already. How do you go about promoting your company for an investor, like an investment minded person, an investor, or like, in other words, as looking for, what do you expect to hear, or does it matter really what the entrepreneur is going to say? Because if it's not in a specific field, or let's say as an investor you are mostly interested in cell therapy and gene therapy, so whatever they might be working on, it's not going to be, there's not nothing you can really do if you're not working on those fields. Or maybe there is something that you're working on that is not in those fields but might be attractive for the investors. And how do the entrepreneurs make that, can convey the message and like catch the attention of an investor? I don't know if there's any, sometimes I wonder, is there anything that an entrepreneur can really do like
No,
or should they
I think there's a
pick the
lot. I mean,
right?
we could spend this whole time talking about what entrepreneurs can do, because I do think there's a lot that entrepreneurs can do in
Yes.
order to get the interest of an investor. I think one of the most important aspects of entrepreneurship in terms of raising capital is being able to tell a really compelling story, right? A story that makes it clear to anyone why what the entrepreneur is doing could actually be really important in the world, right? And sometimes I think entrepreneurs either don't quite make the case well enough as to why their idea is really big, or they don't actually convey credibility that they can navigate all of the barriers to avoid that big idea from becoming a reality.
Okay.
Um, Whenever you design a deck, right? Whenever you design a deck to pitch to an investor, when you think about it, a deck could be very different depending on what your company is. You could be spending most of the time in the deck trying to explain to somebody why a particular area of unmet need is very compelling, right? Sometimes that's a waste of time because the investor already understands that that area is an area of unmet need. So, for example, if you are developing a therapy for cancer, you don't need to spend a very long time explaining why that's an area of unmet need. The investor gets that. On the flip side, if you're trying to develop a product for a disease that most people have not heard of because it's a very rare disease, then you do need to spend some time explaining what that is, right? So, same thing with execution. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward what you're going to do from an execution standpoint. For example, you have a drug, you're going to take it through phase 1 and 2. It's pretty clear what types of activities you're going to be doing. Sometimes you're not taking a conventional path. You're trying to do something that's direct to a consumer, or you're trying to do deals that are more business to business. So the time that you spend covering different aspects of the presentation really matter depending on the opportunity that you are pursuing. Because I think you're trying to do two things, and it's two things only. One, you want to make sure that the investor gets why what you're doing could really make a difference in the world. And the second thing is you want them to feel that what you're doing is actually doable. And it's doable because you have the right team, because you have the right plan, you have the right set of advisors around you. What you're trying to do is actually rational and people will rally around you, right? Because those are the two things. An investor is going to be interested in continuing a dialogue with you if, one, they think what you're doing is really interesting and really compelling, and two, if they believe, you know what, you're going to do it. You're going to be able to get that done. And if there's a concern about either thinking like, I don't know if there's really a need for this area, or if they're like, I don't know, you're just facing very difficult headwinds to try to do what you're trying to do, that's what's going to make them come out of that meeting and say, you know what, I think I have other opportunities that look more interesting based on those two criteria, if I can be simplistic, that I should be spending my time on.
Right. And then when you say like the investor needs to think it's a really interesting and compelling idea, uh, what does the investor usually have in mind to decide if something is interesting and compelling? Is it like a more like a market size or the revenues, pers- like the revenues expectations for that company, or is like the unsolved need that the company is going to be working on, or is a
Yeah, I think
combination
I
of
think
all of
it's
it?
I think it's all of those things.
Hmm.
And it's also the competitive landscape. Maybe that's the one thing you didn't mention.
Okay.
Because, for example, if you are the 15th company to be doing something that's a big market, then it becomes like, okay, I know it's a big market, but man, there's another 15 people competing with you. I don't know that you'll succeed given that your competition is so fierce unless you have an angle for how you're going to get there. But if the competitive landscape is not that strong, then it's about the idea and them feeling confident that that idea and that big market that you're going after is actually real,
So
right?
does that mean that the deck should explore competition a lot, like
Absolutely. A lot of times entrepreneurs, they make the mistake that they want to focus on all the great things about the company and they don't really want to discuss the negatives. The negatives meaning the competition that could be a real threat or issues, risks around the science of what they are trying to put forward or big headwinds that are going to be coming in their direction. And the mistake in not covering these big risk areas is that if you come pitch, right, and you convince me that your idea is really big, but in the back of my mind, I'm worried about the risks and you didn't cover any of them, and I leave the meeting like, Danielle didn't cover the competitive landscape at all, and I know that it's a very competitive area, then I draw my own conclusions. You never had a chance to actually give me your view on why you can navigate those risks, right? And so it's important to get the investor excited about what you're doing, but also to address the key areas of risk because those two things are very connected.
and I think that's so important. When I used to advise investment funds in the past, and that's something that never goes untouched, like the negatives. It's all like, at least as like from my experience helping investors, um, we're always looking and trying to find the negatives as investors. And if I think that the message here is that if the entrepreneur can explore those negatives and address them in the deck, it'll be more beneficial for that investment thesis. Like it'll, it'll help the relationship with the investor, probably, right?
Absolutely. And you can get some feedback, right? What an entrepreneur should do is a lot of times when you're going into your very first investor meeting, you don't know whether, do the investors get the size of the opportunity? Are they overly worried about the risks? You don't really have a feel. So you almost go in like, well, I'm going to cover everything and see where the questions come up. If you start to realize that most of the investors don't have an issue with the idea. They think it's a great idea, but they're concerned about one or two or three specific risks because these keep coming up. Then you should realize that and then have more information around some of these areas. Maybe you don't want to put them on the main deck, but you want it as backup so that the minute the question comes up, you're prepared to take a really deep dive into those areas so that at the end of that hour, the investor is like, you know what? Big opportunity. Seems like they have good answers for the risks. Maybe I do want to do another meeting to understand some of these in more detail. But
Uh-huh.
learn as you're talking to the investors. Hone in on the questions they're asking. And don't be afraid to actually ask for a little feedback, right? An entrepreneur can always reach out to an investor and say, listen, I understand that you're passing. Could you just help me understand, as you think about my biggest challenges as an entrepreneur building this company, what would be the biggest two or three things that other investors may actually want to understand in more detail so that I can adapt my deck and do a better job next time? Ask that, because investors
Uh-huh.
don't have a problem sharing that information if you're asking for it.
That's a great insight. So ask investors what might be holding them, like and like worrying them about your thesis and your company.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I tried to do that when I was there. This was actually pretty typical at Venrock. Like, we always thought that it was if an entrepreneur is spending an hour talking to Venrock about their idea, it was always respectful for us to at least give them a notion for why we're passing, right? So I always made it a point whenever I passed to send a note that said, thank you very much for the time, but here is one or two reasons why this isn't a fit for us right now. And generally, that would, in a way, outline the main areas, which are the reasons. Sometimes it's like the market is not big enough, or we're not comfortable that there's been enough validation in this area, or we're too worried about some of these other competitors. But something that gives the entrepreneur some insight as to why we struggle to actually gain traction with that idea.
Okay. And I guess this is like how much percent of the companies, how many are selected in the end? Like it's a very
Oh, it's
small
very
percent.
few. I mean, like I told you, right? I probably listened to over 1,000 pitches, and out of these 1,000 pitches, probably there was a handful of companies that ended up getting to the finish line with an actual investment. So it's important for an entrepreneur to understand when you're meeting with an investor, that investor, on average, right? There's ranges around these numbers, but that investor is probably already on the board of a few companies that they have already invested in. There's probably two or three that they're very seriously taking a look at and spending those 30 to 50 hours trying to work up. And then they're just meeting with an additional 4 to 5 companies per day, right? Looking for those next opportunities that'll make part of that triaging process. And so the investor is really seeing a lot. And whenever you're being invited back for a second meeting and a third meeting and people are doing due diligence, that's a good sign that you're getting those hours and that time.
Right. Yeah, those are very, very valuable insights, Fred. Appreciate it so much. But then you were telling us about your journey, and you were an investor, and you moved to entrepreneurship. Did you go directly to Artiva where you are today, or how did you go about like getting to the position you are at today?
Yeah, no, so well, I think it started around my fourth year in venture. um, I realized that, back to the things that I was mentioning to you, right? You are triaging for most of the time, particularly as a junior person in a venture firm. You're spending a lot of your time taking meetings and then passing on those companies so you can focus your time on the ones that you may invest in.
Hmm.
I always felt like one of the things I didn't like about that is I was sitting there listening to these very enthusiastic entrepreneurs who want to change the world. And my goal was to find the fundamental flaws in what they were doing, right? So they were on the other side of the table, very enthusiastic, with a construction hat on, trying to solve problems. And here I was focused on risk. I kept asking myself, what would it be like to be on the other side of the table, right? Where I am
Uh-huh.
actually trying to build and to try to tackle challenges as opposed to just sitting there and looking for some of the risks that were in place. So that's when the I had the bug to become an entrepreneur. And I spent, some time while I was at Venrock thinking about what would be the best path to do that. Should I maybe join a small company and be part of an entrepreneurial team, or should I start my own company? One of the experiences that I had while at Venrock is to see many companies go from idea to a formed company with institutional investors around the table. So I was familiar with the playbook, right? There is a playbook. You
Right.
have an idea, you build a deck, you hire advisors, you get some initial seed funding for the idea. You start looking for institutional funding, right? There's a playbook that entrepreneurs have to go through. And having seen that playbook, whether it's from outsiders that came to Venrock for funding, or even some of my peers at Venrock who started their own company, I was open to the path that I would take. So I ended up going down the path of starting my own company. At the time, this was 2011. This is at the time when the BRIC countries was an important investment theme. You remember this well.
Yeah.
There was a period of time when the projected growth for Brazil, Russia, India, China was exceptional. There was exceptional expectations for what they would do. Given that I am from Brazil, I thought maybe there's an opportunity to start a company in Brazil where I could access products that are being developed in the US, and I could build a commercial platform in Brazil to actually sell those products. It was actually a fun experience for me because I had this idea independently, and then I pitched it to Venrock, right? And then Venrock found the idea intriguing because, again, at the time, there were many companies that were pursuing this BRIC thesis,
Uh-huh.
and they agreed to actually invest in the company, and they became the largest investor. So that was fun to go from, investor in a fund to that fund you to go pursue an interesting idea.
Interesting. And then that's how you became an entrepreneur.
Right. So I did that for a 7-year period. In 2008, I transitioned to chairman of that company. The company is still running in Brazil. I joined a biotech company in San Diego called Vividian in 2018. I joined that company as president and chief business officer. I stayed there for a little over 2 years. And then in the beginning of 2021, I joined Artiva, also here in San Diego, as CEO.
And then, as an entrepreneur, what were your main challenges running a company? Running, because eventually you got to run a company. Now you know how it is, how it feels like to fundraise from an entrepreneur perspective, and how to uh, build teams. What is the main challenge? Is it the science? Is it building the team? Is it the time that it takes for a drug to be approved? Is it fundraising? From your perspective now?
It's all of the things that you're saying, right? I
Okay.
find being an entrepreneur a thrilling experiences because you know this, you're an entrepreneur. The highs are really high because you know the role that you played in getting things done. And the lows are really low because you're alone, right? And you have all of these problems that you have a team and you have investors and you have a board, but nonetheless, you're that node in the hierarchy where everybody is looking to you to have an answer for things. And you couldn't do it without your team and you couldn't do it without your board. But everybody knows that a lot of that is sitting in your shoulder. So the challenges are all the ones that you said. You have to build a team. You have to progress. You have to develop your product. You have to constantly be worried about fundraising, since in life sciences, you're constantly fundraising for a really long
It
time.
never ends, right? It's like a continued
Never
effort. Even if
ends.
you're not actively fundraising, what are you doing in that regard? You're always like in contact with investors, or like updating them on what's going on. How do you do
Yeah,
that?
you are. I would say you're always talking with investors because another tip that I have for entrepreneurs is if you're meeting with an investor and they're meeting with you for the very first time and they don't know anything about your business, you have a high hurdle because they don't know you, they don't know your story. On the flip side, if you meet with an investor and you tell them about your story and they're not interested in investing, but now they know your story. And then a year later, you come back to them and you say, hey, remember my story? This is all the progress that I have done between then and now. Now they're beginning to know you. They're beginning to see how you operate. They're beginning to see whether you actually meet the plans that you lay out. They start to understand your story in more detail because now they have a more longitudinal perspective on it. So it's always a good idea to be constantly meeting with investors because you're building that relationship and you never know when they're going to invest,
Right.
but sometimes you do. I recall in my tenure at Venrock that there were entrepreneurs that I met with for many years before Venrock ended up investing, right? And part of the reason why Venrock ended up investing is because we saw how that entrepreneur made progress over a very long period of time. So there are things that are within your control as an entrepreneur, right? You can control your execution, the people you hire, how you tell your story, how you decide to do certain aspects of execution. I would say the ones that bother me the most as an entrepreneur are the things that are outside of my control. And there are two things that come to mind. The macro is outside of my control, right? There are periods in time when investors are very eager to invest. And in those time periods, you can raise more money. It's easier to raise capital. You feel like you have good headwinds behind you. And then there are periods when it flips. Investors are feeling very negative about your space. They're feeling very, very reluctant to invest. It's harder to raise larger rounds. And so that's completely out of your control. You could have a perfectly great business plan, but because of the macro, now all of a sudden you have to make changes, right? So that's one thing that's very hard for an entrepreneur. The second thing is the science. We go into things hoping that the science is going to work. But one of the amazing things about what we do is that we are generating new insights into science every day with the work that we're doing. Sometimes those insights are favorable to your business plan. Other times they're not favorable. You think that a mechanism may be important in a particular disease area, and it turns out after you run preclinical studies or clinical trials that it's not actually that important. So now you have to pivot. Do I have something else in my portfolio that I can work on? Or maybe I didn't run the right experiment. Is there a different experiment that would show a utility in another area? So the macro and the science is something that is completely out of your control. Everything else you can control more. It's just hard, right? It's hard because, as you know, Danielle, sometimes, hiring, for example, hiring is challenging, right? We interview people. We bring people that we feel are very qualified, that have a really good fit, but it's not until you actually start working with someone that you really know whether there's a very good cultural fit, whether the personality is a good fit with the rest of your team, whether they have that right expertise that you actually need. So you work really hard, and it's just hard what we do, right? Because there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's always surprises that keep coming along the way.
Yeah, totally. I think that this being a channel for academics and scientists who are venturing into entrepreneurship, the level of uncertainty that you deal with as an entrepreneur is so much bigger than that. Uh, my point is, like, when you are an academic, much of your success depends on your own talent and effort. And when you're running a company, there's so many variables that are totally out of your control, like financial markets, the science is this, particularly in a science-backed company, right? Uh, People, the team, like a lot of you have to do your best as a leader to make everyone uh, run like and make put an effort towards a specific direction, which is the same for the entire company. But at the end of the day, the success of a company depends on it's a sum of the personal successes of everyone in the team, and you can't really control what the team is doing on a very personal level, like in the there's so many variables, like
I agree. And you bring up a really important point, which is this notion of many people, when they become an entrepreneur, they were probably an individual contributor somewhere, right?
mhm.
And as a CEO of a company, you have to transition from being an individual contributor to actually being somebody that's focused on the performance of the team. Because you cannot succeed without focusing on the team, empowering your team, having the right team members as part of your team, and doing everything you can to enable them. Right? In my career, when I was working at the Boston Consulting Group, and when I was working at Curigen, and even most of my work at Venrock, it was about my contribution. I would go alone and I would do my research, I would talk to doctors, I would write reports, and I would present on those. It was about my contribution.
Uh-huh.
When I became an entrepreneur, I realized it wasn't about my contribution anymore. Of course, it was. I had my role to play, but it was more about helping the rest of the team and having the right team members to actually do their part. And I think it takes some entrepreneurs a really long time to realize that they have to flip that switch from just focusing on what they can do to actually empowering their team. A lot of entrepreneurs complain that it's a very lonely place, right, to be the CEO of a company. And that is particularly true if you haven't actually flipped the switch and realize that the success of your company is based on the success of your team. And the more that you put things on your shoulder for you to try to address on your own, the more you're going to feel alone and the more you're going to be ineffective, right? So that's a really important lesson that it should have been obvious to me, but it took me a little while to figure that out. I remember starting my entrepreneurship career still being very much an individual contributor, and I had to make that transition. And as that transition happened, I felt that my team was becoming more effective as a whole.
It is such a challenge, like because being an individual contributor and being the maestro of an orchestra, and like and bringing everyone to the same page and everyone making everyone pursue the same goal is those are two different situations that require totally different mindsets. So, and if you are, say, an introvert, it could become a challenge for you to be leading other people. And many people in academia are introverts, and then you have to. It's totally doable at the same time. You can have everybody. Every manager has their own style, like managing people, and that has you have to essentially learn what your style is and find a team that also resonates with your style and with you, like because sometimes sometimes the team could be like an individual contributor could be a great addition, a great asset uh, in your team but not in another, and vice versa. Like people could be not performing well as part of your team because every team has a culture. It's not only about you leading the team, but at the sum of the parts of a team, it results in a culture. And some people perform pretty well in that kind of culture or not, or they perform really poorly, but they might perform pretty well in totally different cultures. So finding the right match is a real challenge.
I completely agree with you. And I think that, again, a lot of scientists that have actually done really well in their career and have been good individual contributors, because I experienced this, I'm sharing this because this is something that I learned, but it took me a while to learn. And I wish I had thought about this a little bit earlier. To your point, the leader is building that culture. When you're an individual contributor, you're used to doing your work really well, right? You
Right.
go off, you spend the hours you need, and you always come back with really good work. You're used to people thinking you're really smart and you have all the answers and you pride yourself because as an individual contributor, you want everybody to think that you have all the answers and that you know what's going on. But once you start leading a team, if you go in with that same attitude where you are the one that has all the answers, where you're the strong individual contributor and everybody there is just there to follow your lead, then you wasted an opportunity to be empowering your team to actually have autonomy, to actually be doing their own things. People will realize with individual contributor leaders, like, listen, the individual contributor leader is just going to do what they want to do anyway. So I'm not even going to try hard to come up with my own answer because they're just probably going to do things their way. Instead, if you come in with an attitude of, how do I encourage my team to think independently? How do I give them the space to actually be able to come up with their own ideas? How do I make sure that everybody understands that my ideas are ideas that deserve to be debated and picked apart by the whole team? They're not necessarily gospel that's going to be followed. If you don't do that intentionally as an individual contributor, it's very hard. You just go into your MO of starting meetings where you have all the answers, you have all the direction, and then you go from there. And I tell you, CEOs like that, I think we always hear stories about some CEOs that are Steve Jobs and others, but I think it's the rare CEO that's able to succeed without actually having a really strong, empowered team to actually do things together.
I have I have it's related to this. I just got a received a question here on LinkedIn. Um, how do you see? What are your thoughts on personality tests for hiring, specifically pass fail testing methods? Do you use them at all?
I don't. I know a few people that do. Um, I'll just share that from my experience. I think it's hard to know what's going to work. I have worked with a diverse enough group of people, and I have often been surprised with the differences of what my initial expectations were and how those people turned out to be. And in some cases, there are certain personalities that I didn't expect that would perform really well, and they do. And there are other times when there were certain personalities that I thought, oh, this is exactly what I'm looking for, and that didn't really work out. So I have used, DISC, and I have used Myers-Briggs, and I think that those are very useful so you understand what the other person is like. But to say that my goal is to hire my whole team with a particular characteristic, I think is a mistake, because studies have shown that it's a diverse team that can actually tackle the biggest problems. If everybody has a particular personality, then you don't benefit from a diverse personality set and opinion set. So I haven't actually used those. And I think that academically, people are still on the fence as to whether that is a very useful tool and correlated with good performance, or whether it's just a way to get to know people you're interviewing a little bit better. So by the time you're making the decision, you have, a few more insights on their personality and their, intellectual capacity and so forth.
Yeah, I can totally agree with that position. In my experience, I've had first of all, diversity is so important. And if you had to pick one personality, which one would that be? I mean, I'm really not sure. And I shared the same experience of having hired people who I thought would be great contributors, and at the end of the day, they weren't, or they left, or they were not committed. Because you can be great on a personal level, like individually, but you're not if you're not really committed to the company and to that project, it can be actually worse, because then you're gonna leave, or I mean, or you're not gonna be as committed. So those are in and I've had people I've hired people who we were not very sure about, and then they perform stupendly, so they did very well. So it was like I shared those experiences. And one thing that, depending on the role, can come very useful is more like a knowledge test and practical test. Like if you have to deliver some having the candidates deliver something during the process, like a case or something like that, I personally find that quite useful. It's a great opportunity to interact with them on a very realistic basis, like very similar to what they're gonna find working with you in the company. So I like those
I
strategies as
agree
well.
with you. Some of these tools like DISC and Myers-Briggs, they tell you a little bit about personality. But to your point, there's a lot of things that you can't really test. How committed is someone? You cannot really test that. How constructive are they in meetings? Because, for example, there are people who have very short temper. They're not really constructive in meetings. And that makes it really hard for the team to actually gel and make progress. It's hard to determine that because people are in their best behavior, when they are actually interviewing. I really like the idea of cases and having people do some problem solving and then defend that problem solving to you, because it gives you a chance to understand how they think. It shows you, as you're probing them with questions, how they react under pressure. And it gives you a chance to, have a few more insights into what they're like. But really, nothing replaces just working with them for
Yeah,
a few weeks to see what that's like.
I
In
agree.
an ideal world, we're working with people for a month, and then we're making a decision as to whether we're continuing or not, because there's no other way of knowing somebody, right? Until you
Yes.
work with them.
I've hired some one. There were like situations where I was looking for just one person, and I couldn't decide between two, and I hired both, and kind of let the destiny decide. I mean, there were those were not like a super critical positions like at sea level. You cannot do that with sea levels, for example. But if those are positions that you can actually have more than one person working in the company, like an analyst position or something like that, or like a programming, I've done that in the past. And also one thing about the another thing about the case approach is that not only do you find more about how the person operates, like in a real scenario, but also you can also evaluate commitment, or how much they're willing to get that position. Because if they put a lot of energy in that process, it means it tells you a lot about how committed they are to that opportunity comparing to others that they might be exploring as well. So I think that's it's a good approach. One thing, like we don't have much more time, but you're mentioning before that interacting with investors constantly is important. So I think my question was, how do you do that in practice? Is it how do you keep a constant contact with them? Is it through like conferences and events, or like just reaching out spontaneously, or what are the best approaches in your opinion?
Yeah, look, the first advice I would have is to track your investor interactions, because if you don't track and you've met with 50 investors, it's very hard to remember who exactly you met with. Oftentimes, there's multiple team members that you meet with, and it's hard to remember how the conversation went. For example, did you meet with an investor that was particularly eager to see what the next 6 months of data was, and they would love to see that, and now you're coming back to show them? If you don't write down what the next step with that investor is, then it makes it very tricky for you to manage them appropriately. So what I like to do is I like to keep track of who I meet with, and then to write a simple one-liner, what would be next steps? And sometimes next steps is come back to this investor in a year after I have X data generated, right? That way you're reminding yourself, and there's an action item there for you. So first advice, track who you're meeting with and what a next step would be. Then to your question about conferences, or whether you are actually just reaching out, you could do it either way, right? Um, you want to spending time with investors could be a huge time sink, right? Because there's so many out there. And if they're each of them wanting to spend 5 hours with you, then you have no time left to operate. So you have to be somewhat thoughtful. Maybe you have a target list of people that you're going after. Maybe there is a certain subset of investors that are very interested in your particular area that you're investing in. So you have to be thoughtful about how much time you're spending, as well as making sure that those interactions are constructive, that you're helping them in their journey to get to know you.
Right. I think this is great advice. Thanks a lot, Fred. So at the end of the day, it's like treating your investors as you treat your pipeline of sales pipeline. Let's say you're
Exactly
selling
the same.
projects, like
Exactly the
it's
same.
because it pretty much it is what it is. It's a sale, right? Like you're
Right.
selling
I
your
mean, look,
product.
we oftentimes, so I work in biotech and I'm developing drugs for patients, right? Obviously, my customer is going to be the patient. But I want to be very clear, over the next 5 to 10 years, one of my customers are the investors, because they're the ones who need to like what we are doing in order to write a check.
Right.
So in my mind, the investor is just as important as the customer, because without the investor, I can't get the product to market
Totally agree.
so that the patient can benefit.
In particular, in a biotech, you don't really have the whole lot of customers if you are like developing the science. So the investors, it's they take that energy. They're like they become the target of the sales energy of a company. Okay, yeah, that's a great approach. Uh, what else, Fred? We don't have much time, and I want to be conscious of your time. Is there anything that you like to add, or anything, any other tips for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, maybe just one tip. We never talk about failure, in,
Failure is
in
so important.
entrepreneurship. And I think a really difficult challenge for an entrepreneur, particularly like a scientific entrepreneur who has been working on something for a long time. It's the question of, when is it time to quit? When have you done enough experiments around an asset or a mechanism to actually tell yourself, is this the best thing that I, the entrepreneur, could be doing with my time? Or have I really ran enough studies where now, if I can be objective and I can stare at my project and I can assign a probability of success, when is it just so low that I really should question whether I should continue to go down this path? Or is it time to transition to another project where I can have big impact? I think
Mhm.
entrepreneurs need to have grit and they need to have perseverance. That is really important. But they also need to know when is the time to quit and to actually move on. It feels terrible when you are the entrepreneur and you're quitting on an idea because you're perhaps that really strong individual contributor. You've never failed. You've always been excellent at what you did. But sometimes, for external reasons or internal reasons, projects just reach the point where there is no path forward. And I find this is really true in biotech. Biotech companies don't die. Sometimes they live for 30 years and it's failure after failure after failure, but they find a way to continue going. And I just think that sometimes people need to take a step back. If my goal is to help patients, is my current role the best role that I could have in order to help these patients, or should I be doing something else?
This is great, Fred, and I've been there, making those decisions, and part of that story. And yeah, this is so important. And it's even though we know it's important to know when it's time to quit, it's really not that simple. Like it's like so many variables, so many circumstances and emotions and things like that's when I think working. I think that'll be my last question. Like I like having mentors and coaches, and to a great extent, you are a great mentor to me. So I think those things are so important, and that's I think that's one of the best approaches or the best ways for you to know when it's time to quit. And not only that, but all sorts of decisions when it comes to venture building. Do you agree with that? Do you also have your coaches and or people you confide with? How do you?
Absolutely. And I think that sometimes we as entrepreneurs are not fair to ourselves. We're really suffering with something, but because we're entrepreneurs, we have to put that confident face on and we have to go out and say that we're enthusiastic. But I have found myself many times as an entrepreneur really depressed and feeling like I don't see a way out of this situation. And I felt at that moment I didn't have a lot of people to go to. I feel that as I get older with more white hair, I'm a lot more comfortable being able to talk to people about my vulnerabilities and my
Yeah.
insecurities because I feel I've had some success. So I'm not so insecure about being in a tough situation. But what I encourage every entrepreneur is what you're feeling is normal, but don't deal with it alone. Go to your mentors, go to your trusted people because you'll be surprised how many people have been at the bottom of the gutter without seeing any way out. And they just manage to work through it. And you need a pep talk. You need somebody that you can talk to about these
And
things.
sometimes just mental health. It doesn't really need to be someone that understands your business situation, or a combination of all of that, mental health and coaches. And yeah, I totally agree with that. Well, Fred, thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much for sharing your story and your advice. It was very, very valuable. I really
My
appreciate you
pleasure.
coming here. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to close our interview.